Hello everyone, Ruffled Bricks here with the RB Sides, a music review channel dedicated entirely to remix EPs and albums. In this video we are going to look at Amon Tobin's 2003 EP, Verbal Remixes. This EP came at the tail end of what I would consider to be my favourite era of Amon Tobin's work, where he's working predominantly with samples. Verbal was a track from his fourth album, Out From Out Where, which is, I think, the last album he did under this style before he started experimenting more with originally generated material in the form of albums like Foley Room. These days he's been doing a fair amount of experiments in the world of rock and folk music with his alter egos Only Child Tyrant and Figueroa, although there's still been some dark ambient experiments released under his own name as well. In this review we're going to look at the 4 remixes that make up the Verbal Remixes EP and see what effects they have on the original. Verbal was the lead single from Out Where, and actually the only single from it. It was originally released as a standalone single in 2002 and was accompanied by an instrumental, an a cappella, and a couple of B-sides. Out From Out Where is the first Amon Tobin album I actually bought back in the day, and to date it is still my favourite one. It feels like the moment when he just truly mastered the sample transformation phase of his career. Tobin's first 2 albums under his name were very much based around jazz samples for the most part, which basically followed on from his debut album under the name Cujo. But around the time of Super Modified, it feels like his sonic palette just started broadening quite considerably. Like, the jazz samples are still in there, but then there's a lot more stuff from the world of industrial, rock, a fair amount of classical stuff gets involved as well, and the overall sound that he creates ends up being this kind of magical, big-scale melange of beats. I think, broadly speaking, Super Modified is probably considered the classic album in his repertoire, but I personally think that Out From Out Where just develops that sound a little bit more to the point where it more or less achieves perfection. Verbal very much makes sense as a lead single for this album, as it's the only track on the album that actually contains original vocals. The track starts with a flamenco guitar loop accompanied by a tambour rhythm that gives it a nice threatening pulse at the beginning, and over the top of that you hear vocals from the little known MC Decimal R. I've tried to find some information about this MC. I was unable to, other than some sort of ticket link that said he didn't have any concerts coming up soon. The actual substance of Decimal R's vocals is pretty much impenetrable, as the vocal is heavily processed and cut up throughout the entire track, basically to the point where it's just scattershot gibberish. It comes right out of the gate over the top of the flamenco guitar, and then after a few bars the massive stomping industrial beat that underpins the track comes in. What's great about this era of Amon Tobin is just the way that he managed to make his tracks sound enormous. There's other tracks on Out From Out Where that have this same device as well, like Rosie's or Proper Hoodage. They all just give you this feeling of being menaced by giant robots beating people up and stealing their dinner money. It's underpinned with a minimal but propulsive bass line, and then there's a little extra funk guitar that comes in as well. Although it seems like it's a funk guitar, it's kind of muffled, so it's hard to really tell exactly what it is. It definitely makes the track funkier than it would be if it wasn't there, that's for sure. The main issue I have with this track is I feel the vocal gets overused in the first half. It basically starts with the track at the beginning and then it continues uninterrupted for the first 2 minutes, which I think somewhat dampens the impact of a fair amount of what's going on in the track. Once the vocal drops out, you start getting some other interesting elements to it, like this strange demonic choir that almost sounds like a very slowed down version of Nelson Muntz's laugh. There's a breakdown towards the end that kind of allows some air into the track and adds some fun little fill-ins with the percussion. But it kind of feels like these elements could have been spaced out a bit better along the course of the track. rather than all backloaded as they currently are. I think this is probably the reason why this track is one of my least favourites from Out Where, although listening to it now there is a lot that I like about this track. Like many of Tobin's tracks from this time, a lot of different elements have gone into it, which is very much a godsend as far as remixers go. Verbal Remixes is actually the second single release of Verbal and came out a year after. The full title of the digital and CD release is Verbal Remixes and Collaborations, as not only does this contain 4 remixes of Verbal, but it also contains 5 tracks that Amon Tobin did in collaboration with other artists. I'm not going to go into the collaborations much in this review, given that this is a remix review channel, although I will say that the Collaborations EP is probably my single favourite Amon Tobin record ever. Basically, every artist he works with on this EP, Kid Koala, Bonobo, P-Love, Steinsky and Double Click, all managed to bring something of his sound to the fore whilst keeping Amon Tobin's sound very much recognisably his, but they all kind of help push it in interesting new directions that I think really bring out the best in him. The Collaborations EP I've actually had on vinyl ever since it was first released back in 2003, but the Verbal EP I've only actually bought this year, as the vinyl versions of the 2 EPs came separately, whereas the CD and the digital one are all intertwined. The first remix on this EP is by glitch hop producer Prefuse 73, who I must admit I'd not heard much about in a long time. I remember Pitchfork used to go on about his work quite a lot, but I had no idea he was still making music until I did this review, which very much seems like a me problem. I'm not going to hold that against him. Prefuse's remix probably sounds more like the general 90s Ninja Tune roster than a fair amount of Amon Tobin stuff does. It's got this kind of bouncy Tupperware box beat to it, and the flamenco sample seems to have been filed down a little bit so that it just gives the track a bit of more of a spring in its step. I have to say though, I find the processing on this track a little on the irritating side. The elements of this remix are all quite stuttery and glitchy, to the effect that it sort of sounds like you're listening to a radio station that's struggling to stay tuned in. The decimal R vocal gets even more dishevelled by Previews, who add some scratching effects to it, and the whole thing just feels a little bit too fidgety for me. It does have some nice soulful R&B keyboards in the, I guess what you charitably refer to as choruses in this track. So there is a little bit of respite, but overall I find this one a little bit heavy going. It's too fidgety and disruptive to be chill hot, but at the same time it feels too lightweight to be used outside of a lo-fi hip-hop playlist. The second remix comes from Topo Gigio. Discogs gives very little information about this guy other than he is not an Italian cartoon mouse. Gigio's remix goes for a much more melodic 70s sci-fi approach to the track, slavering it with these big orchestral samples, some otherworldly chimes, and a few little synths here and there. I particularly like the first breakdown of the track, which brings in some muffled jazz samples and a few unexpected chord changes. It takes the track in a new direction, which it feels fully committed to, but it still kind of builds on the original. In some ways it feels bigger than the original, but there's a slight problem with the percussion on this one. The original industrial beats were possibly a little too aggressive for what Gigio's doing with this one, and rather than find a replacement beat for it, he's basically just made them quieter. So they've got that kind of drowned My Bloody Valentine loveless feel to them, as they just kind of get smothered by all the other elements of the track. So it maybe feels a little bit too soft focus overall, but it's still a really cool remix. Then we have Kid606 coming in with a dancehall devastation mix. My main knowledge of Kid606 is that around about that time that this came out, he was more of a gabber and breakcore producer, although his work around that time does contain a lot of lighter and more melodic elements to it as well. In this remix, Kid606 takes the beat and basically reshapes it into a heavy dancehall rhythm. Very reminiscent of what The Bug was doing around about that time with his album Pressure. And the vocals absolutely fit this concoction like a glove. They really work on this track, although Kid606 does kind of tease the way that they come into the track rather than putting them straight out there, so there's a bit of a run-up. What I like about this remix is how stark it is though. There isn't really any major kind of like breakcore diversions or anything like that. The beat pretty homogenized, a few little echo effects here and there, but on the whole it kind of stays on the straight and narrow. There's a few little melodic slash harmonic elements that have been added here and there throughout the track, and what I quite like about them is it seems that Kid606 has made very little effort to make sure they're all in tune. It sort of doesn't really matter though, like they're few and far between, and they kind of like just bubble up every now and then to give the track a little bit more flavour. There's a ringing tone at the beginning and throughout the track, which sounds like a default alarm from a mobile phone. Yeah, I really like how heavy this remix goes. It just really gets straight to the point. The final remix on this EP is from Boom Bip, another hip-hop producer, who at the time is probably most well known for his work with Dose One. Around about this time though, you can start hearing a lot more post-rock influences coming into his work, particularly in his 2005 album Blue Eyed in the Red Room, which features collaborations with Nina Nastasia and Gruff Rhys from Super Furry Animals, who he'd eventually go on to form the duo Neon Neon with. These influences particularly come to the fore in this remix, which is the slowest, most driftiest remix of the bunch, if that's a word. It starts off with this breathy electronic beat, and then this moody, almost pastoral guitar kind of just starts drifting along over it. The guitar itself and the subsequent melodies that flow over the top are very reminiscent of earlier Mogwai, although the more electronic upbeat rhythms give it more of a feel of maybe the kind of dub punk you'd hear from the likes of Outhud. Either way, it's a surprising refit of this track, and the vocals from Verbal, when they eventually come in, surprisingly fit on it pretty well. The guitar melodies have some subtle variations on them as they go along as well, which keeps the track interesting, and just when it feels like it's starting to run out of ideas around the 3.5 minute part, out of the breakdown comes the original stomping beat from Verbal, which just takes the track over the top. There's a really nice tension between the hip hop and the post rock elements of this track, and although I think it could probably have used maybe one more thing towards the end to top it off, I'm not quite sure what, I still think it's a really interesting take on Verbal. So that is the Verbal Remixes EP from Amon Tobin. Favourite remix on this EP would have to be the Kid606 one. I just really like how heavy this one goes. I love the focus on the original industrial beat and the way that it kind of retools it into being this huge pulsing dancehall rhythm. Least favourite remix on the EP is the Prefuse 73 one. I don't think it's awful, but I do think it seems to be a little unsure of what it's trying to do. It just kind of feels a little slight compared to all the other takes on it. Are these remixes better than the original? No, but they're mostly pretty worthwhile. At the very least, all of them offer interesting, unique takes. And at the very least, this remix EP comes with the collaborations as well. So even if none of them make the original redundant, it's still a very pleasing package. Thank you very much for watching the review. Please do subscribe to the channel if you want to see more reviews of remix EPs and albums in the future. Do you agree with this review? Do you disagree with this review? Any thoughts on other remix collections I should review? If so, please leave a comment down below. This review is over.